In a tense congressional hearing, Chief Justice John Roberts glares at Representative Jasmine Crockett, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're unfit for this room!" But Crockett, a legal firebrand, is ready to turn the tables and expose his overreach in a clash that will shake the nation. The air in the congressional hearing room was thick with tension, the kind that makes your skin prickle and your breath catch. Rows of polished wooden benches were packed with reporters, lawmakers, and onlookers, their whispers buzzing like static. At the center of it all sat Chief Justice John Roberts, his black robe a stark contrast to the gleaming marble backdrop, his face a mask of calculated authority. Across from him, at the witness table, was Representative Jasmine Crockett, her posture defiant, her eyes locked on his with a fire that could burn through steel. This wasn't just a hearing, it was a showdown, and everyone in the room knew it. Crockett had been summoned to testify before the House Judiciary Committee, a rare and controversial move. The reason? Her recent blistering public criticism of the Supreme Court's decision to overturn a decades-old voting rights precedent, a ruling that critics argued gutted protections for minority voters. Crockett, a civil rights attorney turned congresswoman from Texas, had taken to the airwaves, calling the decision a judicial coup and accusing the court of legislating from the bench to suppress black voices. Her words, sharp and unapologetic, had ignited a firestorm. Conservative lawmakers, furious at her attack on the court's integrity, demanded she answer for what they called seditious rhetoric. The hearing was their chance to humiliate her, and Roberts, as Chief Justice, had been invited to weigh in, an unusual and provocative role for a sitting justice. Roberts leaned forward, his fingers steepled, his voice low but cutting. "Representative Crockett," he began, each syllable deliberate, "your reckless accusations undermine the very foundation of our judicial system. You claim to champion justice, yet you slander the institution that upholds it. Do you even understand the gravity of your words?" The room fell silent, the weight of his challenge hanging heavy. Reporters scribbled furiously, sensing blood in the water. This was no ordinary rebuke. It was a public dressing down from the head of the Supreme Court, a man whose word carried the weight of centuries. Crockett didn't flinch. Her lips curled into a slight defiant smile, and she adjusted the microphone, her movements calm but purposeful. "With all due respect, Chief Justice," she said, her Texas drawl laced with steel, "I understand the gravity just fine. I'm here because I called out a decision that stripped millions of their voting power. If that makes me a threat to your system, maybe it's your system that needs questioning." A murmur rippled through the room, a mix of shock and admiration. She wasn't just defending herself, she was throwing down a gauntlet. The real-world context of their clash added fuel to the fire. Roberts, known for his measured demeanor, had faced growing scrutiny over the court's recent string of polarizing decisions, from voting rights to campaign finance. Critics accused him of steering the court toward a conservative agenda, eroding public trust. Crockett, meanwhile, had built a reputation as a fearless progressive, her viral takedowns of opponents earning her a loyal following, but also a long list of enemies. Her comments about the court had struck a nerve, especially with Roberts, who saw her as a reckless populist threatening judicial independence. He'd agreed to appear at the hearing, sources said, to personally counter her narrative and reassert the court's authority. But Crockett was no stranger to high-stakes battles. As a former defense attorney, she'd faced down hostile judges and prosecutors, honing a razor-sharp legal mind. Now, as Roberts tried to paint her as an uninformed agitator, she saw an opportunity, not just to defend herself, but to expose the cracks in the system he represented. "You say I undermine the judiciary," she continued, her voice steady but rising with passion. "But what about a court that overturns settled law without a shred of evidence that it's protecting the Constitution? What about a court that ignores the real-world impact of its rulings on the most vulnerable?" Roberts' jaw tightened, a flicker of irritation breaking through his composure. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, not in public, not by someone who refused to bow to his title. The committee chair, a stern Republican from Ohio, banged his gavel, trying to regain control. "Order!" he barked, but the room was already buzzing, the energy electric. Reporters were live tweeting every word, and social media was exploding with hashtags like Wine Crockett vs. Roberts. The hearing was spiraling, and it was clear this was only the beginning. Crockett leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving Roberts. She knew the stakes. One misstep, and she'd be branded a radical who disrespected the highest court in the land. But she also knew she had the law on her side, and a gift for turning the tables. Roberts thought he could intimidate her into silence, but he was about to learn she was no ordinary opponent. As the chair called for a recess, Crockett's mind raced, already mapping out her next move. The real fight was just getting started, and she was ready to make history. The recess ended with a sharp gavel strike, snapping the room back to attention. Jasmine Crockett sat poised, her notes neatly stacked, but her eyes burned with resolve, still fixed on Chief Justice John Roberts. He returned her gaze, his expression unreadable but his posture rigid, betraying a man unused to being defied. The hearing room, already a pressure cooker, felt like it might combust. Reporters leaned forward, phones glowing with live updates, while lawmakers whispered strategies. Crockett's bold opening had shifted the dynamic, and now every word was a potential landmine in a confrontation that was reshaping public perception of the judiciary. The committee chair, Representative Hargrove, a conservative with a reputation for theatrics, cleared his throat. "We'll resume with questions from the panel," he said, his tone clipped. "Chief Justice Roberts, you've heard the witnesses' remarks. Do you wish to respond?" It was a loaded invitation, and Hargrove's smirk suggested he expected Roberts to dismantle Crockett's argument with surgical precision. The room held its breath. Roberts adjusted his glasses, his voice measured but laced with condescension. "Representative Crockett, your passion is noted, but passion is not precedent. The Supreme Court interprets the Constitution, not public sentiment. Your claim that our voting rights decision suppresses black voices is not only inflammatory but legally baseless. Perhaps you'd care to cite a specific error in our reasoning." His words were a challenge, a dare to prove she could match his legal acumen. The subtext was clear. He saw her as an activist playing lawyer, not a peer. Crockett's pulse quickened, but her face remained calm, almost serene. She'd anticipated this, Roberts trying to trap her in a technical debate, to expose her as out of her depth. But she wasn't here to play his game. She was here to change the rules. "Chief Justice," she began, her voice steady, "I'm happy to engage on the law, but let's not pretend this is just about citations. Your decision struck down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which required pre-clearance for states with a history of discriminatory practices. You argued the formula was outdated, but you ignored data showing ongoing voter suppression, gerrymandered districts, polling place closures, ID laws targeting minority communities. My question is, how does ignoring that evidence serve justice?" Gasp rippled through the room. Crockett hadn't just answered. She'd flipped the script, putting Roberts on trial. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of surprise betraying his composure. "The court," he said, his voice tighter now, "is not a policy body. We rule on the law, not on speculative outcomes. The data you cite was considered, but it did not outweigh the constitutional limits on federal overreach." His tone was dismissive, but the room sensed weakness. He was defending, not attacking. Crockett seized the opening. "With respect, sir, that sounds like a dodge. The Constitution isn't a vacuum. It exists to protect people, not to shield decisions that disenfranchise them. You say you considered the data, but your ruling didn't address the 1,200 polling places closed in minority districts since 2013, or the 400,000 voters purged from rolls in states like Georgia. If that's not suppression, what is? Her words were a blade, precise and unrelenting, and the room erupted in murmurs. Reporters typed furiously, and social media lit up with clips of her takedown. Hargrove banged his gavel, his face reddening. "Order! Representative! You will address the Chief Justice with decorum." But Crockett didn't blink. "I'm addressing him with facts," she shot back, her voice rising just enough to command attention. "And the fact is, the court's ruling has real-world consequences. If you want to talk precedent, let's talk Plessy versus Ferguson. Separate. But equal was legal too until it wasn't. Bad law isn't eternal." The room was chaos now, lawmakers shouting over each other, some cheering, others jeering. Roberts' face was a storm cloud, his hands clenched on the table. He wasn't just being challenged, he was being schooled, and by a congresswoman half his age. "You compare our work to Plessy?" he said, his voice low but venomous. "That's not argument, that's grandstanding. You're not in a courtroom, Representative. This is Congress." His words were meant to sting, to remind her of her place, but they only fueled her fire. Crockett leaned forward, her eyes blazing. "And this is democracy, Chief Justice. The people I represent deserve answers, not lectures. If you think my questions are grandstanding, try answering them." The room froze, the audacity of her challenge hanging in the air. Even Hargrove seemed stunned, his gavel hovering but unused. Roberts stared at her, his silence louder than any retort. For the first time he looked rattled, and Crockett knew it. As Hargrove scrambled to move to the next questioner, a Republican ally of Roberts, Crockett felt the weight of the moment. She'd drawn blood, but the fight was far from over. Roberts was regrouping, and his allies on the committee were ready to pounce. She glanced at her notes, a faint smile playing on her lips. Let them come, she thought. She was just getting warmed up, and the nation was watching. The hearing room crackled with barely contained chaos as Representative Hargrove, his face flushed with frustration, handed the floor to Representative Dalton, a Republican from South Carolina known for his loyalty to the judicial establishment. Dalton's eyes gleamed with the confidence of a man who thought he held the upper hand. Jasmine Crockett sat composed, her faint smile a quiet challenge, her notes untouched, but her mind razor-sharp. She'd rattled Chief Justice John Roberts, forcing him into a defensive crouch, and the nation was glued to their screens, dissecting every word. But Dalton's presence signaled a shift. An ambush was coming, and Crockett braced for impact. Dalton adjusted his tie, his voice dripping with Southern charm, but edged with menace. "Representative Crockett," he began, "you've made quite a show today, lecturing a Chief Justice on the law. But let's talk about your record. You've called the Supreme Court corrupt and illegitimate in public statements. Isn't it true you're just sowing division to boost your own profile?" The accusation was a low blow, designed to paint her as a fame-hungry opportunist. The room tensed, waiting for her response. Roberts leaned back, his expression neutral but his eyes locked on Crockett, sensing an opportunity to regain control. Crockett's smile didn't waver, but her gaze hardened. "Representative Dalton," she said, her voice calm but cutting, "if pointing out flaws in a system that's failing my constituents is sowing division, then I'm guilty. But let's be clear, I'm not here for clout. I'm here because your party dragged me to this hearing for daring to question a court that's rolling back rights my community fought for. You want to talk records? Let's talk about the court's record. Ruling after ruling favoring corporate donors and voter suppression over everyday Americans." Her words were a surgical strike, redirecting the attack and exposing the hearing's true motive. Dalton's face twitched, but he pressed on, sensing blood. "You dodged the question, ma'am. You've accused the court of corruption without evidence. That's not critique, that's defamation. Do you have proof, Or are you just pandering to your base? The room buzzed, reporters scribbling furiously. Dalton was baiting her, hoping she'd overreach and give Roberts an opening to dismiss her as unhinged. Crockett leaned forward, her voice steady but infused with righteous anger. Proof? Let's talk about the undisclosed gifts and trips justices have taken from billionaire donors, or the conflicts of interest when justices rule on cases tied to their spouse's work. Those aren't rumors, Representative. They're documented. And when the court strikes down voting protections while those questions linger, it erodes trust. You want evidence? Look at the 60% of Americans who say the court's too political. That's not my base. That's the country. The room erupted in murmurs, some lawmakers nodding, others shaking their heads. Social media exploded with clips. Crockett strikes again, trending nationwide. Roberts, silent until now, couldn't resist. He leaned into his microphone, his voice icy. Representative, you're treading dangerously close to libel. The court's integrity is not your punching bag. You speak of trust, but your reckless allegations are what erode it. His tone was a warning, a reminder of his power, but Crockett saw it for what it was, a sign she'd hit a nerve. She met his gaze, unflinching. Chief Justice, I'm not here to throw punches. I'm here to ask questions you don't want to answer. If you're so confident in the court's integrity, why not support an ethics code with teeth? Why not demand transparency? If the court's above reproach, what's there to hide? Her words were a dare, and the room fell silent, the weight of her challenge sinking in. Even Dalton seemed caught off guard, his prepared retort faltering. Hargrove, desperate to regain control, interrupted. That's enough, Representative Dalton. Do you have further questions? But the damage was done. Crockett had turned the tables again, forcing Roberts and his allies to defend the indefensible. Dalton, scrambling, pivoted to a safer topic, grilling her on her legislative record. But the room's energy had shifted. Reporters were live tweeting her ethics code jab, and pundits were already debating its implications. Crockett's allies on the committee, sensing the tide turning, exchanged subtle nods, ready to amplify her in their turns. Robert's composure was fraying, his fingers tapping the table. A small tell, but Crockett noticed. She knew she was pushing him to the edge, but she also knew the risk. One misstep, and his allies would bury her in accusations of disrespecting the judiciary. As Dalton droned on, she glanced at the clock, calculating. The hearing was far from over, and the next questioner, a Democratic ally, was up soon. She could feel the momentum building, but Roberts wasn't done fighting. His eyes, cold and calculating, promised to counterattack, and Crockett steeled herself. The nation was watching, and the next move could change everything. The hearing room pulsed with anticipation as Representative Dalton's time expired, his questions trailing off into a weak jab at Crockett's voting record. Jasmine Crockett sat unflinching, her eyes catching the faint twitch in Chief Justice John Roberts' hand, a sign of his mounting frustration. She'd cornered him, exposing cracks in the Supreme Court's armor, but the air was heavy with the promise of retaliation. The next questioner, Representative Lena Vasquez, a Democrat from California and a fierce ally, rose to the podium. Vasquez's reputation for sharp, incisive questioning sent a ripple of unease through Roberts' allies. Crockett allowed herself a fleeting moment of hope, but she knew Roberts was plotting his counterstrike, his steely gaze fixed on her like a predator waiting to pounce. Vasquez wasted no time. Representative Crockett, she began, her voice clear and commanding, you've raised critical concerns about the court's voting rights decision and its lack of transparency. Can you elaborate on how these issues impact your constituents and why this hearing matters? The question was a lifeline, a chance for Crockett to solidify her case. The room leaned in, sensing a pivotal moment. Crockett nodded, her voice steady but laced with urgency. Thank you, Representative Vasquez. In my district, Dallas County, We've seen polling places slashed by 30% since the court's ruling. Elderly Black and Latino voters, some who've voted for decades, now face hours-long drives or lines in the heat. These aren't hypotheticals. They're people I represent, people who feel their voices are being silenced. This hearing matters, because when the court dismantles protections without accountability, it's not just law, it's lives. Her words were raw, grounded in real-world pain, and the room felt their weight. Murmurs of agreement rose from the gallery, and Vasquez nodded, her expression grim but resolute. Roberts seized the moment to interject, his voice sharp and authoritative. "Representative Crockett, you speak of impacts, but you misrepresent the court's role. We don't set election policy, we interpret the Constitution. Your anecdotes, while emotional, don't change the legal reality. States have the right to manage their elections. Blaming the court for local decisions is a distortion." His tone was a reprimand, a calculated move to undermine her credibility and shift the narrative back to his turf, legal theory over human cost. Crockett's eyes flashed, but she kept her composure, sensing the trap. "Chief Justice, with respect, that's a convenient line. The court's ruling didn't just interpret. It unleashed a wave of state laws that disproportionately hit minority voters. You can't wash your hands of the consequences when you open the door. The Constitution protects voting rights, not just state power. Why didn't your decision grapple with that balance?" Her question was a direct challenge, forcing Roberts to confront the human toll he'd dismissed. The room buzzed, reporters typing furiously as "Ish Crockett" as Roberts trended globally. Roberts' face tightened, his fingers no longer tapping but gripping the table. "The court," he said, his voice low and edged with irritation, "does not exist to solve every societal ill. We ruled based on evidence before us, not speculation about future state actions. Your argument assumes bad faith, which is both unfair and unproductive." His words were polished, but they rang hollow against Crockett's grounded passion, and the room sensed it. Vasquez, seizing the moment, pressed further. "Chief Justice, if the court's rulings have foreseeable consequences, shouldn't it consider them? Representative Crockett's data isn't speculation, it's documented reality." The question caught Roberts off guard, and for a split second his mask slipped, revealing a flicker of anger. "The judiciary," he snapped, "is not a legislature. We don't predict outcomes. We apply the law." But his defensiveness only fueled Crockett's momentum. "Then why?" she cut in, her voice rising with controlled fury. "Did your ruling ignore the Justice Department's report on voter suppression? It was submitted as evidence. If you're just applying the law, why cherry-pick what counts?" The room erupted, lawmakers shouting, some cheering, others demanding order. Hargrove's gavel slammed repeatedly, but the chaos was unstoppable. Roberts. Allies on the committee exchanged frantic glances, sensing the narrative slipping. Representative Hargrove, his face a mask of barely contained rage, tried to steer the hearing back. "We're veering off topic," he barked. "Representative Vasquez, your time is nearly up." But Vasquez, undeterred, used her final seconds to amplify Crockett. "The American people deserve answers, not deflections. Representative Crockett's questions are valid, and this committee should demand transparency from the court." The gallery erupted in applause, drowning out Hargrove's protests. As Vasquez yielded, Crockett felt the room's energy shift decisively in her favor. She'd turned Roberts' attacks into opportunities, exposing his reluctance to engage with the real-world fallout of his rulings. But the hearing wasn't over, and Roberts' allies were regrouping, whispering strategies to discredit her. The next questioner, a Republican firebrand, was already rising, his eyes locked on Crockett with predatory intent. She braced herself, knowing the hardest fight was yet to come, but her resolve was unbreakable. The nation was watching, and she was ready to push this battle to its breaking point. The hearing room was a tinderbox, every whisper and glance charged with the weight of a nation watching. Representative Jasmine Crockett sat tall, her heart pounding but her expression unyielding, as Representative Tom Carver, a Republican known for his scorched-earth tactics, took the podium. Carver's eyes gleamed with malice, his posture that of a hunter closing in. Crockett had turned Chief Justice John Roberts' attacks into a showcase of her legal prowess. But Carver was here to bury her, and the whispers among Roberts' allies hinted at a final, devastating blow. Yet Crockett felt the tide turning, the room's energy hers to command. She was ready for the fight of her life. Carver's voice boomed, dripping with contempt. Representative Crockett, you've spent this hearing attacking the Supreme Court, questioning its legitimacy, and now you dare lecture a Chief Justice on ethics. Isn't this just a stunt to inflame division and dodge your own failures as a lawmaker? The accusation was a grenade, meant to explode her credibility and paint her as a reckless provocateur. The room tensed, reporters poised to capture her. Response. Roberts leaned back, his face a mask of calm, but his eyes betrayed anticipation. He thought this was the moment she'd crumble. Crockett's lips curved into a steely smile. "Representative Carver," she said, her voice clear and unflinching, "if holding power to account is a stunt, then I'll keep performing. My constituents sent me here to fight for them, not to rubber stamp a court that's failing them. You call my questions division? I call them democracy. The failure here is a system that lets unelected justices shape our lives without answering to anyone." Her words were a rallying cry, and the gallery erupted in applause, drowning out Carver's attempt to interrupt. Social media lit up, clips of her defiance going viral. Carver, undeterred, leaned forward, his voice venomous. "You talk a big game, but you're no legal scholar. You're a politician playing to the cameras, disrespecting the judiciary for headlines. Apologize to the Chief Justice, or admit you're out of your depth." The room fell silent, the challenge hanging heavy. It was a trap. Apologize, and she'd look weak. Refuse, and she'd be branded a radical. Robert's gaze bored into her, his silence a dare to falter. Crockett didn't hesitate. "I won't apologize for speaking truth," she said, her voice rising with conviction. "I'm a lawyer, a lawmaker, and a voice for people who've been silenced. If that threatens you, good. Chief Justice, you've dodged every question about the court's accountability. So let me ask one last time. Will you support a binding ethics code for the court, yes or no?" The room froze, her question a thunderbolt. She'd turned the trap into a spotlight, forcing Roberts to answer or expose his evasion. Roberts' composure cracked, his jaw clenching. "The court," he said, his voice strained, "has internal mechanisms to ensure integrity. We don't need external oversight." It was a non-answer, and the room knew it. Boos mixed with cheers, and Representative Hargrove's gavel slammed futilely. Crockett pressed her advantage. "That's a no," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "And that's why trust in the court is at an all-time low. You can't claim impartiality while dodging transparency. The American people deserve better." The room exploded, lawmakers shouting, reporters scrambling to capture the moment. Carver tried to regain control, hurling accusations of grandstanding, but his words were lost in the uproar. Hargrove, desperate, called for order, but Crockett's allies seized the moment. Representative Vasquez stood, demanding a vote on judicial ethics reform, her voice amplified by the chaos. The motion was symbolic but seismic, a direct challenge to the court's untouchability. Roberts sat motionless, his face a storm of suppressed fury, knowing he'd been outmaneuvered. As the hearing adjourned amid pandemonium, Crockett gathered her notes, her heart still racing. She'd faced down the Chief Justice and his allies, exposing the court's vulnerabilities and igniting a national debate. Outside, Protesters chanted her name, while pundits on every network dissected the clash. The fallout was immediate. Editorials called for judicial reform, and polls showed a surge in public support for an ethics code. Critics accused her of overreach, but even they couldn't deny her impact. Roberts, once untouchable, faced questions about his leadership, his refusal to engage fueling skepticism about the court's impartiality. Crockett stepped into the Capitol's halls, reporters swarming but her focus unshaken. She'd taken on the most powerful judge in America and won, not by title, but by truth. The legal system's flaws were laid bare, and the conversation she'd started would echo for years. As she addressed the cameras, her voice steady, she spoke not of victory, but of purpose. "This isn't about me," she said. "It's about a system that works for all of us." The nation listened, and the fight for justice felt closer than ever.